talk in the LGBTQ book talk series. We are very, very excited to have as our ultimate guest, Darnell Moore, to talk about his wonderful memoir, No Ashes in the Fire. And I know we're all excited to get to Darnell in just a second. And so I'm going to kind of keep introductions pretty brief and then turn things over to Chris, who will introduce our speaker. Before we get started, just a couple of pieces of administrivia. Once again, everyone's muted. So if you do have questions at any point for the speaker, or if you have general questions, please add them to the chat. You will have an opportunity. We will go over those questions when you're in the breakout sessions. And then as always, you'll get an opportunity when you return to add questions before we get to the Q&A after Darnell's talk. Additionally, as always, I do very much want to thank City Councilman Daniel Drum and City Councilman Corey Johnson, as well as New York City City Council for their support for the LGBTQ book talk series. We'll talk a little bit at the very end about some of the other initiatives that are connected to this larger LGBTQ curriculum, including, I'm very excited that my colleagues from libraries will introduce an ebook collection that you all will have access to. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm a member of the Social Studies team. I'm joined by Chris Kermey-Hall, who's also a member of the Social Studies and Civics team, Patricia Sarles, Andrea Swenson, and Michael Dodes, who are members of the libraries team. It's been really wonderful to collaborate kind of across teams on this series. So that's about it from me. Thank you all for joining. And without kind of any further ado, I'm going to move things over to Chris, who's going to just walk us through the agenda and then introduce our speaker.
Awesome, thank you, Joe. So if you've joined us before, this should look familiar. We will do a brief introduction. Darnell Moore will speak to us about No Ashes in the Fire. We will do our breakout and we will end the day with our Q&A. As always, I've gone ahead and dropped the link to this PowerPoint in the chat, as well as the sign in for today, if you're just joining us. So, stop sharing for a moment. There we go. So Darnell Moore is the author of the 2019 Langa Literary Award-winning memoir, No Ashes in the Fire, Coming of Age, Black and Free in America, which was listed as a 2018 New York Times notable book and a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers pick. Moore is also a writer in residence at the Center of African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice at Columbia University, and a 2019 Senior Fellow at the Annenberg Innovation Lab at the University of Southern California. His writings have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Playboy, Vice, The Guardian, The Nation, Ebony, and other outlets. He is the Director of Inclusion and Strategy for Content and Marketing at Netflix, and he's currently at work on his second book, which is tentatively titled Unbecoming: Visions Beyond the Limits of Manhood. So without further ado, Darnell Moore. Digitally clapped.
Good afternoon, late afternoon. I'm in LA, so it's 1 something on my end. Really, really excited to be in conversation with you. So much so that I dipped out of my vacation to make sure that we can be in conversation. What the bio doesn't state is a bit about my background. So like all of you on this call, I spent the first part of my career as a teacher. I taught 8th grade. After that, I ended up working as a clinical counselor for adolescents, and then going into administration within the education field. I served as the director, associate director for the Newark Schools Research Collaborative, and also director of educational initiatives at the Hedrick Martin Institute, where which brought me into sort of the rooms with a lot of the folk within NYCDOE. So I'm just grateful for y'all. I don't even know what it has been like for you to wake up every day with the goal in mind to bring the best you can to your students, given this environment that we're in, given the circumstances that you have had to do this through, teaching even while you're maintaining your lives. So just big shout out to you, and Grace, just much gratitude for you all for giving me space. What seems to be the day or the day before the last day of school. So I know you all are running to vacation. So that said, I hope that I can offer a bit of a framework. I have a few points that I want to make. I'll ask a few questions in between. And I thought that it might be cool, instead of me talking the entire time, to sort of break things up by using video. So I think we're going to try to show a video clip. It's brief, about 7 minutes, from an interview I did with Trevor Noah that was centered on the book. Now, it was great. It was Trevor Noah, right? But my mama was in the audience, which made it even better. And my aunties, and they were screaming. You know, I'm from Camden, New Jersey, so of course they were screaming, "Go Camden" from the back. So we'll open with that. The video might be delayed a bit, but if anything, just try to grab hold of the audio, because I think some of the points that were raised might be some of the things that we're going to talk about.
Such a powerful worldview, one that is filled with so much compassion, considering that as a gay Black person in America, you have faced at many times the utmost persecution. When you look at the journey that gay Black people face in particular, the history of queer rights in America is one that is not hidden, and then Black rights is compounded on top of that. Do you think that makes the experience unique and even more powerful?
Well, so I'll start by saying James Baldwin, when asked this question sometime, how do you feel about being Black and gay? It's like, wonderful. I mean, shit, right? In many ways, I am who I am because of my experience of growing up in the world as a Black queer person. Queerness is magic. It's not poison. It feels good to be free, to be who you are, to be in your skin and name that. But that is also, I think it's important to note that, to be Black and queer, or Black and trans, or Black and gender nonconforming, you're facing multiple issues at once, multiple arrows coming your way. Mm-hmm. Which is why when we talk about LGBT progress, and only weigh that progress with regards to rights that are impacting some, if you're Black and queer, you're not only facing homophobia or antagonism because you're a trans person or gender nonconforming, you're facing racism. And if you're poor, you're going to face all that comes along with being economically disenfranchised. Right. And if you're a young person, you're going to face all that comes along with that. In New York City alone, most of the homeless folk, the young people that live on the streets, about 40% of them are LGBTQ. But when we talk about LGBT progress, we don't think about these particular lies, and I think that's important for us to talk about.
It's something that you cover in the business, is the space of people going we're trying to be ahead of the curve or woke or whatever, and it's but there's still that whole are you gay? Are you gay? How do you think you begin that conversation? Where do you think people start, especially young Black people?
Well, first, we live within a context where, I don't make the claim that Black folk are more homophobic. This is America.
Right.
I mean, that's the Donald Glover song, but this is America, you know what I'm saying? In so many ways, we have a country that is, in just its recent history, have begun to overturn draconian laws with regards to LGBT people. And America likes to tout itself as the most progressive country in the world. We have a lot of work to do in this country, not just with regards to understanding how...
Look at Pride Month and the celebration around being queer. There is that constant idea of we can celebrate the progress that we've made as people, but at the same time there is a lot of work to be done. What do you think still needs to be done within the LGBTQ space? We
definitely need time for celebration. I mean, I kind of wear this shirt with all the ripples on it so we can celebrate. Because we need space to honor and to celebrate difference too. But we have to not be committed to all of the ideas and norms that have been cages for so many people, that have not brought freedom. Mm-hmm. And let me... All right, cool. Now I'm looking at that and I'm I looked so rested there, and it probably had much to do with the makeup. And now I don't even want to look at myself on the screen. But I'm glad, I'm actually glad that I put that back up, because in so many ways it was my attempt at unpacking, or at least offering some nuance as to how we might want to read the book, particularly for those of us who might want to use it in the classroom. And I'll talk about some of what came up in that conversation as I worked through my notes, but I want to open up with a reading. This is from the introduction, and it's just like the first page and a half. Smiles were not rare during my childhood. They were not hidden, but I would never have remembered the joy emanating through my big grin had I not returned to my mama's worn photos of me a few years ago. Some of the pictures were baked by sunlight. I scattered them across my bed and looked at faded images of a thin black boy whose glasses rested on a head too big for his body, hiding eyes that were windows into a world more fantastic than the world he moved through. Long crew socks with colorful stripes covered scrawny legs that were gifts. And not only because they allowed him to run from bullies. He played hide-go-seek and rode big wheels over dirt mounds just as often as he would fold his body into itself when it was time to hide away. I once knew this black boy in the photos, but at some point between growing up and breaking down, I had forgotten. I could not recall his imaginative spark, an infectious laugh, or the sound of his desperate prayers for perfect grades tossed into the universe as if he was aware of his powers. 30 years later, I looked at the photos with keen interest in my bedroom in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, miles away from Camden, New Jersey, the tiny city that was the backdrop of this black boy's life. I was in awe. To laugh and jeer during days punctuated by fear was a feat. What childlike magic did he use to make it through? And how did I get so far away from him, so distant from that smile? I had forgotten my days were not always rocked by violence. It did not occur to me that play would be more evident than struggle. The signposts of happier days were etched on my face in my mama's pictures. I started to remember how I would tap into the strength that I didn't know I had to turn the days following sleepless nights, pierced by my dad's loud punches and my mom's screams, into new opportunities to forget and move forward. My hours of play outside with my cousins and friends provided opportunities to dream about the worlds we could explore beyond cement parks and dirt front yards. Somehow, we learned to appreciate all we had and did not realize all that we lacked. It took years before I realized that the image in my mama's picture was beautiful. With skin too brown, big lips and a wide nose, I often turned from my reflection. As I grew up, there were invisible forces moving about like ghosted hands. A hand would touch my cheek and steer my head and eyes away from the mirror. It was unseen but felt. It needed to be named. I never knew I was poor, lived in a ghetto, or was looked upon as a number waiting to be keyed into a statistical formula when playing school on my grandparents' porch in Camden, riding public transportation from the pothole-lined streets of Camden to my Quaker high school 2 hours away in the posh suburbs didn't terrify me. But the one time I rode home in my white ninth grade English teacher's car, along with my white middle-class suburban classmates, was dreadful. A hand covered my eyes so I could not sense my confounded classmates' astonishment, my cowering presence, and a tight grip of shame that needed to be named. What strong fist pounded away at my desires and beautiful thoughts of a stranger, a boy holding me so close that I would feel faintly his own breath? What force stopped my heart from fluttering, my body from perspiring, my internal light from burning? The force was unseen but felt. I didn't understand then why it had its grips on me, but I know now that it needed to be named. I'm going to stop there. I'll read this one last paragraph. To discover and name what shapes us is to engage in the work of history. I knew writing an honest memoir would require me to tell the truth about my life, which has been full of hostility and splendor. Discovering the difference between what's true and all the lies one comes to believe requires a direct confrontation with the past. Long before I was born, and Camden was made out to be a city full of dilapidated homes, violent drug dealers, crack, nihilism, bureaucrats and greedy business people enacted racist public policies and brokered shady deals, transforming our home into a city tapped of its resources and hope. If Camden is a ghetto, it is because some force comprised of many hands made it so. That too must be named. So I'll start there. because in many ways, part of my writing exercise was an act of naming, an act of reclaiming narratives that had been lost, or that, to be less passive, actively removed from public discourse. But I want to ask a question to the group before I move on with some points. In the chat box, you all can probably you can probably tell I'm a teacher, right? Like, I'm getting very teacherly now. But I actually want us to sort of engage in a discussion. When was the first time that you saw yourself represented in a piece of literature? And by saw yourself, like a character that you felt fully got you, fully sort of explored or brought to the page aspects of your full self. How old were you? Maybe name the book. And if you can, just start plopping some things in the chat box, and I'll wait for a few responses. Question is, when was the first time that you saw yourself represented in a book? The first time, like, you read a book and said, damn, this author, this person writing gets me. Someone says not into my 30s. Someone says in college, and that was through bell hooks. I'm still waiting. 8th grade, 30 years old, 46 years old, college. And I suspect that, yeah, we're gonna keep answering. And I'll give you a few more minutes to put those in, but I'll tell you why I think that's important to ask. So you all are adding your comments, but part of the first reason that I wanted to write this book is because I actually, like so many of you, went through K-12 without having read any books that captured the life that I lived. I did not read books with Black characters, a lot of them. I mean, with the exception of maybe some Richard Wright here and there. But I didn't have access to James Baldwin. No one was bringing Audre Lorde or June Jordan into my classroom. The books that I had access to, and I say this all the time, and you all would probably laugh, centered white people, white characters, and talking animals. White characters and talking animals. And that was the sort of scope of the world that I had access to in literature. The world that I was being presented was one that did not account for my racialized being. It was one that did not at all account for the ways that I understood Black people to live within spaces like post-industrial, predominantly Black urban spaces like the Camden, New Jersey's. Camden, I never read in a book at all, neither in a piece of fiction, but I didn't even have access to history books within K-12 schooling in Camden that provided me with some contextual history for the city that I called home. It wouldn't be until college, and by college I meant these were books that I had to go get on my own, because still in undergrad, I mean, I still didn't have enough books on the curriculum that even allowed for me to see myself. It wasn't until I was in grad school that I sort of began to have access. And what I want to say about that, I wanted to write to me. I was writing a book that I needed. I mean, Toni Morrison said this, right? Like, if there isn't a book if you can't find a book that's centering, and I'm paraphrasing, yourself, you got to write it. So in so many ways, I kept thinking, I don't want another 14 or 15-year-old or their parents or caregivers or the people who has cared for them to go without getting a book that is bringing to the fore the lived experiences of Black and brown, queer and trans and non-binary young people who might be growing up in spaces like a Camden, New Jersey. And what I will say about the sort of danger of that, it's a sort of epistemological, it's a type of violence, an ontological violence, a violence of being, when one does not have access to representations of themselves in literature, which is supposed to be sort of a space where we're exposed to sort of mirrors, right? Our sort of access points into the world. Imagine, and I know that some of you don't even have to imagine, because you're telling me that you too didn't have access to that. To pick up books where you are blotted out of, where your lived experiences do not exist, is an act of violence. And I know that we use that term a lot, but what I'm talking about is the ways that does harm to a psyche. For me, what it meant was that I was left to the imagination, which is a gift, right? Left to the child imagination to think about what a life for me, what a Black queer life for me could be outside of any examples, And if it behooves us as teachers, as educators, to be thoughtful about not enacting that type of violence in the classroom. What it felt like for me as a young person to have no safe space to explore the giddy feelings that I had, the attractions, the questions that everyone else who happened to be sort of non-queer, non-trans, non-binary had access to. It was normalized for them. So my first point was that I wrote this book for me. I wrote it to my 14-year-old self. Literally, as I was writing, I imagined that I was standing in the back of a theater, and the theater was empty with the exception of one little boy, little Black boy with nappy little hair like me, sitting in the middle row. And I would be, as I would write, that was the person I imagined myself writing to. I literally removed the white gaze, I removed the heteronormative gaze, and wrote squarely to that Black boy, or Black person, Black young person. And that was a rationale behind that. The second thing that I also wanted to do is to capture the life worlds of a city that had been in so many ways caricatured within popular discourse as a ghetto. And I wanted to offer a different narrative, not even a counter one, but an honest one. So, you know, when you're growing up in a space like Camden, and some of you are working and living in districts and neighborhoods where our young people are coming from contexts, from homes that they may love, but are always sort of described within public discourse, within media, within social science research as sort of these hell-bent places that are bereft, are lacking virtue. So I wanted to offer, in some ways, a love letter to my hometown, to my people. You know what I mean? I wanted to write back to them and said, I see you. And part of the reason why the book is both a memoir and social history, because it was very important for me to not only write a narrative about the city. You know, I could have described the streets that I grew up on. Some of them were full of dilapidated homes. You know, we would walk down streets where glass was all over the place, and the city looked in a lot of ways under-resourced. You know, I would have people come to Camden and say things to me like, this looks like a quote unquote third world country. But what folk did not have an understanding of, nor did I have an understanding of as a young person growing up in that city, is the long history of economic pillaging, political malfeasance that had structured the city in the way that it did, right? People love to talk about Camden. When I grew up, I lived in a neighborhood that smelled like shit, pardon my language. But here's why I need to tell you that, right? So it smelled horrible. But what I didn't know as a young person, and this is, you know, part of what I also wanted to do was use narrative as a way to sort of get us to think about theory, right? So as a young person, I didn't have access to the language like, you know, environmental racism. But what I did know as a young person was that my neighborhood smelled different than some of the others. Well, come to find out, the county, so in New Jersey, there are counties with neighboring municipalities or neighboring towns. And the suburban towns decided and voted to send, because Camden is the county seat within a larger sort of geographical area, decided to send all of its waste, all of its shit, to Camden to be treated. So I literally lived in a neighborhood where the shit from all of the suburban towns was sent down to my city. Now, that's just one example, right? Like of a way that that type of sort of policy awareness was left out of public discourse. I can go on and on, but in the book, if you read it, what you'll find is that I'm pairing personal narrative with these larger social histories so that the reader is not left to sort of assume on their own that Camden is a city that is what it is because of the Black and brown people that live there. There were a bunch of calculated policies that made Camdens and Baltimores and Trentons and Pattersons and Gary, Indianas into the type of cities they are. So as a teaching sort of methodology, part of what's useful, particularly within the civics or social studies context, is that you get life narrative, which is useful for young people because it gives them sort of an entryway into theory to understand theory. Another thing that I tried to do was to try to offer stories that could allow you to sort of think about theoretical moves without even having to say like a word, use a term like Kimberly Crenshaw's analytic intersectionality, for example. So what I did, I'm like, that, you know, my mom gave birth to me at 16. My dad was 15. My mom was forced to stop going to school at grade 10 to take care of me. She then had to both work low wage jobs. I mean, something like $3.75 an hour as a stock person working at a department store, taking care of kids, relying on government assistance, is both sort of impacted by the fist of the man, the man, her partner in her life, and also the fist of the state. My mom gives birth to me literally at the same time that this notion of Ronald Reagan's sort of welfare queen is floating. Well, it comes from Chicago, right? That was a term that was taken up in Chicago that was then deployed by Ronald Reagan. My mom literally, and I remembered this as a young person, fit the description of what this sort of welfare queen sort of archetype was supposed to sort of be. So part of what I wanted to do was tell my mother's story, and by telling her story, help people to understand the interconnected ways that racial oppression, that structural inequities connected to sexism and gender work, that patriarchy works, right? And I wanted to do that without ever having to use those words. How can we get young people to think about these structural inequities, these systems, these theoretical and material moves without never using the words? And part of the way that we can do that is through applying life narrative, applying sort of personal narrative as a way to get that done. So I want to breathe real quick and checking time, give you an opportunity to breathe too. Maybe you want to pop something in the comment section here. Maybe you had an aha moment. Maybe there's a question, one or two that I can answer now before I move forward. I do see some. Let's see. Y'all have to mind me, I don't have glasses on, so I have to go scroll up. What? Oh, you all are writing a lot. Of course you are, because you're teachers and educators. Any questions? I don't see direct questions, but I also see lots of wonderful. Okay. Can you talk more about that experience? Can you talk more about the experiences that were blocked out of your life? Sure. And what type of support system do you have? Two perfect questions. First, so interestingly, in terms of sort of life writing and memoir writing, and let me just say a bit about memoir versus autobiography. And I had a friend, Kiese Lehman, whose book Heavy is another magnificent book. Also, his fiction work, Long Division, is a wonderful book for young people to read. But Heavy, an American memoir, is also an amazing, groundbreaking memoir. And here's what he says about memoir versus autobiography, and then I'll get to this point about blocking out memories. The difference he makes is that autobiography, while it's mostly sort of chronological, the telling of a sort of through story, memoir is a sort of genre that allows us to think about any particular aspect of a life. From 1 second, that sort of memory or that sort of thing that we're writing about can be a 1 hour experience. And that itself can turn itself into a beautiful sort of through book or a life. So memoir is a genre that is also flexible. It has elasticity. And it is a genre that's not fixed, such that it needs to sort of look a certain way. And over the last several years, there have been some interesting memoirs that come out that plays with shape and genre. Now, I think it'd be interesting to sort of work with young people on sort of engaging memoir as a practice. I would love to see more life writing in schools. But in terms of memory blockages, the way that I organized the book was less about sort of the memories that were blocked out, but certainly trauma has an impact on what we remember, right? Trauma is sort of like, in many ways, blunts the memory so that we block out a lot of the hard stuff that we may or may not want to deal with. Sometimes that blockage becomes a way for us to cope. Not always the best way to cope, but it becomes a way. But what I tried to do was create an outline organized around a set of themes that I wanted the reader to walk away having sat with. So there were 8 themes. And in terms of figuring out what life stories I would tell, I went back after I had the outline and thought about the stories that might be easily mapped onto those themes. But the thing about trauma, you know, I wrote this book, the first part of it by myself in a house in Atlanta, and I was there for 3 months. I'm writing about, you know, memories that I could smell and feel. And it was very hard. It was hard to dance with memories. It was hard to literally walk myself back into a living room where I watched violence enacted and to try to remember as best as possible, to smell, to taste the moment. And I had a community of support surrounding me who were sort of writing and reading along with me that was super helpful. And with the question around support, I want to say, like, as a writer, it was important for me to have that level of support also because I was writing about my father, who also happened to die, who passed away while I was in the process of writing the book, and he was only 55, right? So it was a lot to hold, but it was also a transformative process that created an opportunity for me to be healed by the time I was done. Now, to this question about support, maybe as a young person, what I'll say, I also tried to resist the this exceptionalism narrative in the book. There are many ways that memoirists, you know, we can try to sort of either be easily the hero or the victim, right? This binary. And I wanted to mess with that a bit. And I really did not want people to walk away and say to a young person in the classroom or outside of the classroom, go read this book by Darnell. He's Black. He was from a space like Camden. He came from a low income background. He was the first one to go to college and he made it, and therefore you can too. And the reason why I paired my story with, so there's a chapter on really, and it probably is boring for a lot of the readers, but I wrote a chapter that talked about my middle school experience, but I wrote that within the context of helping a reader to understand all of the laws that were enacted within the state of New Jersey that inevitably disenfranchise the young students there. So what I was trying to say is that there is no need for me to tell a story of which I was the exception when reality is we should be in schools, young people should be in schools where there is no exception. Having access to something like academically talented or gifted classes should not be something for 7 students. All young people need access to that. And that's the argument that I tried to make in the book. There was one more question from someone, Frank. What advice do you give to teachers who also face cultural opposition from parents when wanting to discuss Black queerness? So that's a really amazing question. I would probably ask why, in so many ways, like I think we, look, I say in the context of the US, we love to lie. We don't like to tell the truth, right? So I'm always interested in getting behind the answer. If we know that literature is both an access point, it's a mirror for lived experiences and also a window into others' lived experiences. Then the first argument to make is that by providing young people access to books that are actually providing them those sort of optics it's a value to the young person. Secondly, I would want to know why parents would not have a problem with the curriculum that told stories that were homogenous stories. Why would we want to hear stories that only ever compelled us to think about the lived experiences of, say, white people or straight people? Why, when the world that we live in, when the world that the young people live in, and the world that the young people are actually creating under our watch, is asking of us to ensure that we are providing them with as many tools or spaces as possible through which they can imagine that world. But thirdly, I think it's a responsibility as an educator, particularly within public schools, to suggest that it is actually our job to do that work. And to not do that work is actually antagonistic to our role as an educator. That to me sounds like a response that I would give right away. When I would train young people and when I would train teachers in Newark, I would train 300, 600 teachers at a time, and I would be talking to them about LGBTQI issues. And I remember I would have some teachers say a couple things to me. One, these are our teachers, y'all. Y'all know them because these are your colleagues. I have a lot of trouble teaching about LGBTQ identities in the classroom because of my religious affiliation, or I have a lot of trouble teaching because I feel like this is sort of taking our kids outside of the realm of what it is that they need to learn. And I would stop them squarely there and say, as long as you are a public school educator, you need to leave whatever biases, whatever religious ideologies you have at the door, because the moment you get your ass in the classroom is the moment that you become responsible for ensuring that every student in the class, every single one, feels seen, feels validated, sees himself reflected in the literature, sees himself reflected in curriculum, sees himself reflected in your pedagogy. And to the extent you can't do that as an administrator, I will give your name to a principal so they can get you up out of here. Point blank. So for me, it is about like, this is beyond us doing a service to sort of like LGBTQ literature. This is about the mattering of people's lives. This is about us doing our job, right? As educators, to ensure that there is not another young person like me and so many of you who just named yourself on this chat. You should not have had to sit in schools that did not give you access points to your lived experiences in the classroom, period. Okay, got off my soapbox. I think I have about, we're always out of time. I'll just close and then I think we have breakouts. The last thing I'll say, and I didn't think, look, y'all, I thought I'd be talking for a little bit. Y'all got me on fire here. Is this notion of what it might mean for us to sort of queer curriculum. And by queer, I don't necessarily mean queerness as an identity category that sort of stands for the umbrella of LGBTQIA-TS, right? I'm not talking about queerness as an identity category. I'm talking about queering as sort of an act. Let's call it a pedagogical act in this case, of disrupting all of the normative boxes, all of the boxes that we sort of ascribe normativity to. It's like taking an eraser. That sounds too clean. It's like raising all of the boxes, ridding ourselves of all of the boxes, and figuring out how to create, in the absence of what we consider to be these boxes, something new. Jose Munoz is a queer theorist, cultural theorist, who defines queerness as the not yet here. So if you think about curriculum, what is not yet in the curriculum that needs to be there, such that we can be providing our young people with access to a world's learnings that compel them, right, to be and to think beyond the normative structures that they're given. Queerness is about rethinking and deconstructing the curriculum, the archive. It's about pulling out of the archive those narratives that have been sent there to die, right? In many ways, queer histories have been sent to the archives to die. We've placed queer histories in coffins. So the job of the radical queer theorist, our queer educator, is to go back into the archive, to speak life to that coffin and resuscitate those narratives and bring them into the classroom. I was going to end by reading something from the book, but I want to move because I want you all to talk too. Last thing I'll say, part of this work is about, for us, illuminating the very ways that queer history are very much a part of the mundane, or sort of common histories that we often name. What I was going to read you was a story about an uprising that happened in the city of Camden in 1971. And part of the reason why I included that in the book is because I wanted people to remember that in these spaces that we might imagine as sort of like sort of mainstream narratives about progress or about history, queer and trans and non-binary people have always been present. It's one of the reasons why I co-founded the Queer Newark Oral History Archive, which, by the way, y'all should tap into as a resource for teachers. There's it's an archive that's available online at Rutgers University. And what it was meant to do was resuscitate all of those narratives and stories, those histories, her stories, that have been sort of subsumed. And it's our job, I think, as teachers to sort of bring those to the fore. So I want to stop there, and I think we're going to move into breakouts.
Thank you so much. And I'll listen to your soapbox any day, all day. So if you just like anytime you'd like to do more of that, I'll take it. Thank you so much. I think Chris is going to put up our, thank you, chat. It's amazing. So for those of you who've not been with us before, we are going to go into random breakout groups. We're going to ask you to please introduce yourselves and your pronouns and ideally what you teach. And these are our questions. How are you involving LGBTQ plus stories in your classroom? How might you use No Ashes in the Fire? And please do come back with more questions. We will have plenty of time for a Q&A at the end. We will give you a minute of review, of warning before we pull you back to the main page. And Chris, are we ready? Thanks.
All right, everyone. So as you're rejoining us, I'm just going to give a moment for everyone else to rejoin the main room. Okay, I think that's all of the breakout rooms. All right. So we're going to do things a little bit differently. Before we go into the Q&A, Darnell is going to read an excerpt that he queued up kind of before we started everything and went out into our breakout rooms. So as he's reading, if you have some questions that come to mind, drop them in the chat, and then we will get to them during the Q&A after the reading.
Awesome. I hope you all had a really good discussion. And I queued up a particular part that I was going to read about recounting the 1971 sort of uprising in Camden, but I thought that it might be cool to sort of shift a bit and read from a part of the book called Lessons, where I have this conversation with my mother, where I am inviting her in. I use inviting in as opposed to coming out. Okay. I made it to the office around 9 a.m. I sat at my desk behind a closed door with my hands folded over my eyes. I felt unease. Shame could not be the only reason I was setting myself up for potential backlash, I thought. I had to convince myself that I needed to talk to my mom because it was time for me to confront the terror that had been a faithful antagonist in my life, and not because Shane had forced me to tell her I was gay for the sake of his pride. I needed to talk to my mom for me and him, but also because I knew she needed to hear my truth if we were to be any closer than we were. My assistant phoned my office and let me know my mom was waiting in the waiting area. I took a deep breath, stood up from my desk, walked out to greet her and invited her into my office. I thought I was going to collapse. My thoughts were scattered as I tried to flesh out what I would say. We sat down across one another. I panicked. "Thanks for coming," I muttered with my head slightly lowered so that my mom couldn't look me directly in my eyes while I talked. "Of course. What's wrong? Why did you want me to come up here?" She asked the question as if she had already knew what I was about to say, almost like an invitation. Well, I don't know how to say it. I had practiced the script several times on a long ride to work, but the words were chained to my throat. I couldn't release them. "What is it? Are you sick?" "No." "Okay. Do you have cancer?" Her question was a legitimate concern. We had lost my grandfather to cancer 3 years before, but that wasn't a secret that I needed to share. "No," I responded. "What is it? Do you have AIDS?" "Nah, I have a boyfriend." The words flew out of my mouth too fast to catch them, and there was no turning back. She would either accept me or I would go off to build my life and family without her. "That's it? I knew that," she said with a half laugh. "You knew?" "Darnell, I am your mom. You are my son, and I love you regardless. I've always known. I know that's why you stay away as much as you can." Every word to follow was like a sledgehammer breaking down the thick walls of shame and trapping me. Her acceptance was more healing than any prayer, more uplifting than any group counseling session, more powerful than any force of hate I internalized. I am so sorry for lying to you, Mom. You didn't lie. You did what you needed to do to protect yourself. I wanted to talk to you, but I didn't know how you would respond. I didn't want to offend you, but I knew, and I waited. I felt as if I had received my freedom papers, as if I had been imprisoned in a suffocating cell for 28 years or 10,220 days, and my mother had come along with the keys to unlock the cage. I realized, however, I had been holding the keys all along. I merely shared them with my mother. She was there, sitting opposite me, loving me because I invited her in. She accepted the invitation, and we were both changed as a result. My insides were touched by a love so intensely powerful, my body and spirit were literally reconfigured. I sat up straight. I lifted my head from its lowered position. I opened my mouth and smiled, my stomach filled with butterflies, my heart danced. I wanted to leap and run and scream at the top of my lungs. I am gay as hell, and I don't give a fuck who's mad about it because my mama loves me and I fucking love me too. All of my life, I was taught to believe that single Black mothers who have kids young, like my mama, were the cause of the problems in Black families and the reason Black boys like me made poor choices. We have been taught to believe Black people, especially the economically strapped, are urban, are churched, are Southern, are backward, and less progressive on issues of sexuality. I believed the lies for a good part of my life, but the day my mom, who had birthed me in a Black city when she was a Black girl, affirmed the full expression of my humanity, was the day I decided to always put my faith in Black people, even if my faith would be tested over and over again. I think we can take questions now.
Yeah, I'll give you guys a minute to digest and drop questions in the chat. Seeing a lot of feeling in the chat right now. Just check that out. So we'll start this off. Jacqueline asks, how do you step out of your boxes? What do you recommend?
Cool. So the first thing I'll say is that, well, what do I mean by boxes? We are all born, I think, into many boxes, right? Like, and you all are probably fans of Judith Butler, who talks about like gender and performativity, right? So like this idea that when you're born, before a human person has entered into the world, a doctor comes along and says, it's a boy. Before that child, human person, gets to even name that identity, they are already been sort of grafted into an identity, or let's call that identity a box, and for some people a cage, without their volition. And in so many ways, when I think about boxes or I think about cages, I'm thinking about gender, I'm thinking about sexual ideas about sexuality. I'm thinking about all of the ways that for many of us, these ideas are absolutely not freeing. When I think about my own life, trying to live into the sort of roles, the script book that someone created for me that told me that this is what a Black boy becoming a man ought to be. And by the way, Black children, there's this idea, this theory called sort of accelerated childhoods, which suggest that for young Black kids, you don't even get childhood as an option. You're seen like Tamir Rice in a park at 12 years old as an adult, or a sort of monstrous figure before you're even seen as children. That said, what was clear to me is that my route to freedom came from one, not realizing or coming to an awareness, a consciousness, that so much of the anxiety that I had much to do with me trying to squeeze myself into these boxes that were just too small for my expansive being. That awareness came from the learnings that I got through the books that I read. I mean, I read a lot of Audre Lorde, right? Is one example. I've read a lot of Black feminist works and people who helped me to, I've read works by Black, gay, male feminists who helped me to understand that the ways that gender had been sort of constructed, the ways I was socialized to believe who I ought to be were prison cells. So freedom for me comes from one, having that consciousness, like having our consciousness raised, so that we realize that some of us are sitting, we find comfort in these sort of cages, right? Because we've sort of turned many of these cages into mansions in our imaginations, if you get the metaphor I'm trying to use, because that's all we know. That's all we know. We get comfortable in it so that we think something like manhood is what we ought to strive for if you're male identified. I have a chapter in the book that's called Unbecoming. And the reason why that chapter is so important, and it's also the name of the book that I'm going to work on, is because freedom came from me not becoming the proper man, but failing to acquiesce to what the ideas of quote unquote proper man ought to be, failing at it, or for lack of sort of more vernacular term, giving the middle finger to all the rules that someone else told me that had I not followed, I would have somehow been seen as a failure. But here's the thing about failure, and Jack Halberstam comes to mind, whose book Queer Art of Failure is amazing, another good read for you all. I would not be here if I did not fail at societal standards for who I ought to be. And I'm so grateful that I've had the courage enough to say, you know what, that's not for me. That's not going to work for me. And it meant that I was able to sort of reinvent or apply a radical imagination, or what Robin Colley calls a freedom dream. A freedom dream. In my freedom dream, I saw myself broken off from all those other sort of things that other people told me I ought to be. Oh, so, and I think I probably didn't answer the last part of that. Well, what do you do with this in the classroom, maybe? I think, you know, so here's something a practice I've done. When I'm talking to young people, and particularly, and teachers too, people all together, I tell folks it's so easy for us to name what's wrong. We have a good analysis of all that's wrong. But I've been in so many spaces, and I would tell people, go pair up with a partner. I want you to sit down for just 10 minutes and tell me what a world looks like. A world looks like where, what is your freedom dream? And in your freedom dream, I want you to tell me who's there, who's alive, who has support. How is society structured such that equity can be shared across board so that everybody can have access to safety? And you know how hard it is for people to imagine the not yet here, partially because we're living in what we have. And that is such a liberating practice, to give young people the space to dream what is not yet here, what they have to sort of imagine and be charged with building. A wonderful exercise, a difficult one, because it means that you can no longer rely on the tools that are harmful to us. You then have to imagine tools that aren't. And to do that, your imaginations also have to be freed. So I think that's a really, and narrative, like writing, speculative fiction, like speculative nonfiction, these are ways that you can get young people to actually tap into that imaginary.
Awesome. Ms. McKenzie asks, many of our teenage boys may not know their identity yet. How can we as teachers help them during this time, especially those at the high school level?
So, you know, I think part of teaching is our ability to give young people the space through which they can explore on their own terms. So what would that look like? It looks like, I don't know, providing access to stories that can give them access to expansive ways of being in the world outside of the very limited ones that they know or have access to. Maybe stories that are not always about the hyper-masculine, sports playing, overly hard, the sort of character that is actually sort of living out or replicating all of the ideas that society tells us, quote unquote, boys ought to sort of model. Are there books that offer you know, positive expressions of femme performing our identified, male identified young people? Are there stories that allow for young people to see male identity outside of the frameworks of sort of like heterosexual relationships? Are there stories of intimacy? And by intimacy, I don't just mean sexual, but stories that really do lift up the ability of male identified folk to be sort of like, to live and lean into vulnerability and softness, is, you know, where are the books where boys are not afraid to cry and to hug and to sort of behold one another in their sort of vulnerability? I think the job is to not tell, but to provide space for young people to journey and to sort of figure out on one's own. It's the telling. At least from the standards in which we do the telling, right? Like we come with frameworks that we think young people have to figure themselves into, as opposed to creating a space for young people to sort of explore on their own, for them to sort of dream freely.
Push to talk is not working for me. We probably only have time for one last question. So I'm going to reframe this question a little bit, but it's more of a writer's craft question. What was your process for creating the narrative like for your book?
Yeah, so I did a few things. The first thing I did was actually, I'm sorry, my partner just walked in, and I was like, he looks so handsome. He's got his haircut. Right? It's, you know, this is Zoom world in the pandemic, right? Real time. So the first thing, I wasn't sure what type of book that I would write. I thought that I was going to write a social history, and part of what my mentor told me was that Beryl Satter, who I should name, who we were just talking about during the break, she said, part of what's illuminating about the book is that the stories are what can grab people. So what if you elevated the stories and sort of moved theory or history to this, like as a companion sort of piece? So that was my decision to sort of move to memoir. And part of what I knew what I wanted to do was to write, as I said before, pair a life narrative with social history and urban history. But I developed a set of themes, one-word themes that I wanted that I felt like were teaching sort of pivotal points in my life: running, unbecoming. I can't even think of the others now, but there were 8. So I outlined those and then developed a set of narrative story elements that would illuminate those themes. So instead of me having to sort of tap a long history of a life, I would think, okay, in this chapter on running, where I really want to give people the impression of what it means for many of us to be running not only from home, but to be running into freedom, what stories can I pull from in my life narrative that could apply or help the reader to get the point that I'm trying to raise? And that was sort of the easy, quick route to how I put that together.
Awesome. So we're running down on time. Before we do our good, we have time for one more, Joe? Okay, good. So, because there was one more on the, that I was kind of bummed we weren't going to ask. So what authors or texts would you recommend teaching alongside your memoir?
Oh, that's super, super cool. So Zami is a book that isn't a memoir. I mean, it's a mix. It's a sort of, it's by Audre Lorde. It's called Zami, Z-A-M-I. I think she might have called it an ethnobiomythography. And part of what she was trying to do, and I may have gotten that wrong, was to suggest that memoir as a genre is never ever sort of fixed in terms of memory. Like memory in so many ways are as much an invention of the writer as they are real. So Zami would be one. I also, what else would I have you all, would be a good book to read along that. So one of the things I've also been trying to do is think about books that allow us to think about Blackness, queerness in different ways. So Saeed Jones, How We Fight for Our Lives. Yes, okay. Saeed Jones, by the way, yeah, I got to vote for that book for Lammy. I was a judge. But it's like mind-blowingly beautiful, right? So what you get is another narrative. George Johnson's book also, All Boys Aren't Blue. What you get if you put these 3 books next to each other are these sort of stories of Black queerness, Black male queerness, that show you that Black queerness is not a monolith, and even that sort of Black male queerness is not a monolith. One person is writing from the South, One person is writing from the sort of Northeast. Another person is sort of writing from the standpoint of having a gender identity that was more beyond the binary. And it's an interesting way to take what might seem very sort of small, or at least in the way that we think about Black queerness, sort of monolithic. It's a way to help young people sort of expose or break open that monolith.
So I just want to thank everyone, everyone who's attended from our first talk in early April through our talk today. It was just a wonderful way to kind of cap off the 6 talks. Darnell, thank you so much for sharing your time, your story, your just so much expertise. I think gave us all a lot to think about as we go into the summer and think about our classrooms for next year. So thank you so very much for everything. Thank you to everyone who attended. I will say this is not ending here. This is our last talk of school year 2020. We are already thinking about what next year can look like, potentially expanding these talks into next school year. We're already, and we've introduced different aspects of the LGBTQ curriculum. Many of those things, I actually just got an email while we were here. The first copy of the Hidden Voices book just came in from the designer. It looks, I have to say, absolutely fabulous, and I can't wait till we kind of do our copy edits and get that out to you. The lessons are coming in. Some people mentioned the Lambda Literary Series. We will do our best to make sure that that series continues. Libraries is the team that administrated that. All of these things will continue. Again, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And I just have to thank one more time, Darnell, thank you for everything. Have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, evening. I hope to hear from many of you, all of you soon. Bye.